So first of all, thank you, Radwan and CSID for having us. So first of all, I would highly recommend the book. And the title is interesting, and maybe I'll use that as my jumping off point. It's available on Amazon, and it's relatively cheap. You should buy it, little plug. But so it's called Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism. So it is about Egypt, but it's also about something something broader, about, in some ways, the inherent tensions between small L liberalism and small D democracy. And I'll maybe get to that a little bit more in a second, but I think an important point to highlight is to be a Democrat, to be someone who believes in the democratic idea, it's a learned skill, and it's not super easy to do. And I think that we as Americans think that it's easy because for us, liberalism and democracy have gone hand in hand, and even the way we talk about democracy, it's usually used as a shorthand for liberal democracy. So we haven't had to deal with those kinds of inherent tensions and the questions that maybe Egyptians and others in the Middle East had to deal with in light of the Arab Spring. That said, I think we as Americans have something to learn from the case of Egypt, and it's interesting that some of the rhetoric I've started to hear over the past year in the US about our own politics reminds me of conversations I would have in Egypt. And I'll just give you one example of this. I was talking to a friend of mine who, anti-Trump, he's on the left, he's a Democrat, and he was angry about Trump because he was reading some of the Fire and Fury excerpts, the Michael Wolff book that has just come out, and he sends me a text message and he's like, Shadi, we just have to get rid of this guy. And kind of out of nowhere, he just sent me that text. But he was implying that we should do it either through impeachment or invoking the 25th Amendment. And I tried to push back and tell him that I'm very uncomfortable with those ideas because Trump, as bad as he is democratically elected. I do consider him to be my president, for better or worse. He is a legitimate representative of our country through electoral democracy. And that in some ways gets me to this tension, is for the first time Americans have had to deal with the question of what happens if an illiberal Democrat comes to power through free and fair elections. And I think Donald Trump is quite unique in American history. I would argue he is the first illiberal Democrat we've had as our head of state. And what do I mean by illiberal Democrat? So basically, and I think that the other panelists have gotten at this in various ways, but let me just dial it down to kind of like a simple approach. So liberalism is about the classical liberal tradition, and it's about a set of non-negotiable rights and freedoms, and emphasis on individual agency and autonomy. So that's liberalism, the classical liberal tradition. On the other hand, we have small d democracy, which is more about reflecting and representing the popular will, usually through majorities, depending on the exact system. But generally speaking, the idea is that citizens vote for their representatives, and those representatives then are responsible for policy making. But it's possible in a democracy that you can vote for people who do not believe in the classical liberal tradition. And that can include ethno-nationalists, it can include white nationalists, it can include Islamist movements. And the Muslim Brotherhood is an example of a group that committed itself to the democratic process, but doesn't believe in the ideological or philosophical tradition of Western liberalism. And we also have examples of the Hindu far right coming to power through free elections in India. You could even argue the Israeli government is quite democratic, but illiberal in the sense that Arab Israelis are second-class citizens in various ways. The Philippines under Duterte. The list goes on. Poland under Law and Justice, Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are all examples of people who came to power through free and fair means. They were elected by either a majority or a plurality, but they are not liberals. So in that sense, what we're talking about is a universal phenomenon, and I think we in the West are being tested And I think that's why you'll hear more and more what I consider to be anti-democratic rhetoric from my colleagues and friends on the left, on the Democratic side. I'm on the left. I think Trump is a terrible president. But again, we have to make distinctions between whether someone is terrible and whether they have to be pushed out of office through, let's say, military coups or even a kind of legal coup or a constitutional coup. So that's one thing I wanted to sort of emphasize. I do want to challenge, though, some of my fellow panelists, and maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A, is that if I think about this sometimes. If I was a liberal in Egypt, born and raised in Egypt, what would I have done during the 2013 coup and then the subsequent Rabaa massacre? It's not obvious to me that I would have made the right decision. I can imagine myself that if I was an Egyptian liberal, I would have supported the coup. I think it's actually understandable, however bad it is. So I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying from a liberal perspective, it's understandable why they did what they did. And I think there's also precedents if you look at 18th and 19th century European liberals who were very suspicious of mass politics and mass democracy. And some of them actually supported post-1848 counter-revolutions. So you might recall there were the 1848 revolutions. Many so-called European liberals actually became counter-revolutionaries, and this is something they discuss in the book as well. And why? Because they were suspicious of what the masses would do if there would be universal suffrage. Why? Because they believed that liberalism was an elite project that had to come from the top, and over time, liberalism had to sort of be infused in the masses, and that would be a long process, and only then could people be trusted to vote for their representatives. But before that, democracy was a dangerous thing. So in that sense, this is not the first time we've seen people do this. There is a history there, and there are precedents. And that's how I make sense of, so I'm born and raised here in the US, and I was a very outspoken critic of the coup and of the Rabaa massacre. Almost my entire family in Egypt supported the coup, and in some cases supported the massacre. And I found this to be, an intriguing question. And I mean, I don't think people in my family are evil. I don't think they're uniquely bad people. I don't like all of them, but some of them are dear to me. Some of them I love. And it was a challenge to make sense of how could they come to support the mass killing of their fellow countrymen. Let's put that aside and let's just talk about the coup. And I think there we have to at least try to understand why so-called liberals did what they did. I think part of it is they rightly thought that they wouldn't be able to win in free and fair elections for the foreseeable future. There was such a profound electoral imbalance, and that's different than many other countries where you see more of a balance in society. And I think Tunisia might be one of the few exceptions in the Middle East where there was a stronger secular tradition. There were secular and socialist parties that maybe had more support than they had in Egypt. But what happens when Islamists, Brotherhood and Salafis win about 70% of the seats? That can be very intimidating because you're like, hey, we might not be able to win because liberalism doesn't have a kind of inherent constituency in Egyptian society. There aren't many liberals in Egypt. There aren't many secularists in Egypt, secularists who want to kind of keep the role of religion at least somewhat limited. There aren't a lot of people like that in Egypt on the mass level. So if you don't believe the masses are with you, then you're going to look for ways outside of the democratic process to make sure your liberal ideas are protected, or at least to make sure that Islamists don't dominate for the foreseeable future. And it's possible that they would. I mean, I think that Islamists generally, Brotherhood plus Salafis, probably would have done fairly well in elections for the foreseeable future. Even if they went down from 70% to 55% or 70% to 50%, that's still a majority. So I think that then, so I'll just end here, and what do we do about that? And I think one of the questions that Dalia and Danish pose in the first chapter of the book, I think they have a subheading that is titled, "Can Liberalism Be an Emancipatory Force in the Middle East?" Is there a way to sort of rethink or reconstitute Egyptian liberalism or liberalism in the Arab world, that liberalism can make its peace with democracy? And they offer a kind of some ideas of how that might come to be. I'm actually quite pessimistic. I actually don't think I'm very skeptical it's even possible. Now, we can talk about it from a philosophical standpoint and say Egyptians should do this, and we would wish they do this, but I see no sign, knowing what I know about Egyptian politics, that Egyptian liberals are going to come to terms with the democratic process unless they feel they actually have a chance to win. But even then, I'm not entirely sure. So, and I think it speaks very badly that in Egypt, with maybe, we keep on bringing up Amr Hamzawi as one of the few liberals we can come up with. And when we played this very sad game after the coup, how many liberals can we think of, prominent liberals in Egypt, who opposed the coup? And usually we came up with 3 or 4, and Amr Hamzawi was always one of them. That's literally all you can come up with. It was Amr Hamzawi and maybe 2 other people, which is a very sad state of affairs. So with that in mind, I guess I would pose the question to my fellow panelists, but also to folks in the audience. You know, you can't change. How do you change people, or how do you change liberals and get them to actually fundamentally transform themselves into committed Democrats who are willing to accept the results of elections? I don't know how you do it. But I think one thing, and I'll just close with this, 2 possible ways forward, and I think this is actually something you hear from some members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, is that there could be, perhaps, if there's a political opening in 10 or 15 years in Egypt, or maybe in 30, maybe in 5, I don't know, but that there would be an interim period where the Brotherhood and whatever parties are tied to the Brotherhood would be very careful about not contesting. They would, in a sense, lose on purpose, at least in the beginning, to give liberals and secular parties a chance to compete and to build up their party organizations and to avoid a kind of polarization. Another option is to sort of table Sharia and divisive national identity issues and religious identity issues and say, we are not going to deal with Sharia during the interim period. And we're gonna wait, we're gonna get there once the transition is safe and secure. And the last thing I'll say is on the state, and I think Danish alluded to this, is that there is an obsession with the state on both sides of the political spectrum in the Arab world, but particularly in Egypt, an obsession with state power. And people can't even think of politics outside of the conception of the state. And that was, I think, a big problem in the transition, that people were panicking over who would be president because the president is such a powerful figure in a centralized system like Egypt. So everyone wanted that prize. And it was very hard to let it go and say, we're going to let someone else win the presidency. So the question, I think, for the Arab world going forward, and particularly for Egypt, is how do we move from this very state-centric approach? How do we encourage decentralization? How do we encourage local politics? How do we, in a sense, weaken the state so people are not so obsessed with gaining the state and using the state as an engine for either liberalism or Islamization? Because I think that was the fear on both sides, that whoever wins the state can then use the state and the state apparatus to reshape society at large. So I'll end there, and thank you.